In this video, I discuss some tips for how you can draw better fur. The first tip I have for drawing better fur is to think of fur as shapes. And there are two ways that you can do this. One is to pick out the shapes you see if you're using a reference photo and try to isolate different areas or values to draw. Values are the most important thing to get right with your drawings. One of the biggest mistakes I see people making with their fur is not putting in the proper values. It really is important that you get your darks as dark as they need to be and your lights as light as they need to be. Without having proper values, your drawing ends up looking flat. The second is to draw your fur in shapes. Don't just fill in fur anywhere and everywhere. You need to be thinking about the shapes that you're drawing. Creating realistic fur is all about building structure with the shadow shapes you put into the fur. A great way that you can help yourself with trying to build shapes with your fur is to, for say example, if you're working on an animal like this tiger, for example, that has a bunch of stripes, one of the ways that I have found works the best for me is to go through and fill out all of the darkest sections of the fur, and then I worry about trying to fill in all of my other values into the fur. If you get your darkest values in first, that actually helps you kind of judge the other values of your fur in between the white of the paper and of course the darkest value that you just filled in. Then you kind of narrow the gap between the wide range of values that you would need to make up your fur. And another thing that this does for you is help you kind of map out everything else for your drawings. It essentially helps you kind of judge the distances or shapes and where those shapes need to be at on your drawing between a lot of different areas throughout your entire drawing. So take for example, the nose on this tiger. There is a section of the nose that is completely filled in and is pretty much black. And by filling that in, then I also, of course, have the darkest value that I just mentioned, as well as that helps me get the shape of the nose, which then helps me also get the other shapes around it. When you're trying to isolate shapes, you need to try and just literally like take whatever reference photo or whatever you have in your mind, just take that image and blur it. As an example, I have a blurred photo here and you can see all of the highlights, the midtones, and the shadows. And it's much easier to look at things in terms of what shapes they are instead of the fur details, because the fur, you can't really make out much of those fur details anymore. All you see are shapes. But when you're trying to draw your drawings, this is how you need to be thinking about things. Don't think about the fur. The fur is a technique and repetitive type of strokes that you're making. It's a technique. It's not necessarily what you need to have in your mind. And you need to be thinking about the shapes that you're creating. So in order to create those realistic drawings, you need to think about the different shapes that divide the mouth, the lip as it hangs down lower than the jawline, the nose and how high up it comes, how far out it comes. All of that needs to be taken into consideration. And then with, of course, the fur, how much of there's stretched out and long shapes of fur and which kind of directions those shapes curve. All of these shapes that I'm talking about are highlight shapes. Those literally, like, divide those up as an individual entity. Those are a shape. Mid-tone shapes and shadow shapes. It's all just shapes. It's your mind that puts everything together when you finish your drawing that actually tells you what an object is. If you get caught up in thinking about what it is you're drawing throughout the drawing process, you kind of get lost in it. You can't really think about things as for what you're seeing. The key to having realistic drawings, not just fur, is to think of everything as shapes and how you're going to either mimic those shapes or we can get more technical with shapes too, and you can think about the different patterns of shapes. So take a different type of fur texture or rock texture. Maybe we're not working on fur all the time in our drawings. We have rocks that we're putting in with our animals, or, you know, There's different types of rock textures that you need as well, and how you would get those is by identifying the different shape patterns and trying to mimic those. And you're essentially doing the same thing when you create fur. The next tip that I have is to build your fur in layers. This also ties into values. You need to make sure that you have a range of different values to build fur with. I typically start off with the lightest shade I have, like a 2H, then I begin working in slightly darker fur strokes, either using the same 2H and pressing a little harder with my pencil, or I use an H. This is what I would consider the highlight values of my fur. Then I would start working in the mid-tone values using either a B or 2B, and I make some strokes of fur layers to build into the fur with these. Then I take a 4B and work in the darkest values for the fur. Usually I do one layer to fill in all of the particular section I am working on, and then I go over it again and again until I get the overall value as dark as it needs to be. And oftentimes, once I've gotten the overall value as dark as it needs to be, then I have the highlighted sections that aren't always accurate. And generally, I would say that they aren't always accurate. I just consider this a normal process because it is easier to get them too light because you can always go darker. Whereas if you went too dark to begin with those lighter layers, then you have a bit of a problem trying to erase everything you just did to lighten those lighter values. So then what I do after that is take a 2H or a B and go over the top of the highlighted sections to fill them in and bring the values down a bit to where they need to be. Now, it doesn't mean that that always has to happen with the fur drying process. Sometimes you'll fill in an area, put in your darkest values, get all of your darkest values and dark shapes the way that they need to be, and maybe your highlights in those particular sections are actually as accurate as they need to be. It's just a process of trying to analyze your drawing, see where it's at and what it needs to be, and deciding if you need to do that or not with each particular section that you're working on. Now, another thing I don't do is press very hard to do any of these fur stroke layers. That is one thing that is important when drawing with graphite, is to make sure that you don't press too hard or you will end up burnishing, which smooths out the surface of the paper and makes it impossible to add any other layers over the top later. Now, it's also important to remember that building fur layers is a process, not an event. So it takes time to build them, and I go through multiple points in my drawing process that I recheck my value accuracy and make any necessary adjustments. You can learn more fur drawing tips from the top right video, and you can also learn to draw wildlife and pets with my real-time 1 to 15 hour drawing tutorials with a voiceover of tips and explanations over on my Patreon. Signing up gives you instant access to a growing library of tutorials, and new ones are added each month. I'll have a link in the video description. Thanks so much for watching. See you in the next video.